And yet if you asked a black belt in Rio de Janeiro 40 years ago if there was a system, they might not know that that's what they had.
Yeah, they had implicit knowledge, but not explicit knowledge. The goal of a teacher is to make implicit knowledge explicit. That's how you can take information from here and implant it in the mind of a young man over here.
That's what you do.
Yeah, that's
for a living.
That's what I do. That's my job. And I remember sitting there going like, holy crap, that's it. Jiu-Jitsu is a system of grappling. The techniques of Jiu-Jitsu aren't that different. Sambo has many similar techniques. Judo has even more similar techniques. Wrestling has similar techniques. But they didn't give you that step-by-step guide. Wrestlers in those days had to improvise.
Yeah.
It's not easy to improvise in a fight.
Yeah.
Make mistakes, errors of judgment.
Yeah.
And then I remember thinking like, holy heck, that's big. At that exact moment, a massive fight broke out downstairs. I had to run downstairs. And I remember in the middle of this crazy fight, like all the lights on, bottles flying around. I'm thinking like, I can't get killed in this fight. I can't get killed. I've got to stay alive so I can get this information out there in the book. And I remember...
you must have felt like Einstein or something.
No.
But I mean, you must have felt...
But I did feel something significant had been said. And I was like, that's an insight worth writing down. I remember I strangled a guy unconscious, and he was bleeding heavily from a cut on the head, and my hands were covered in blood. I still remember clear as day, on a freezing cold winter night, coming out, the fight had cleared, the cops had come, and people were taken away in cuffs. I took out my little notebook and pen, and my hands were covered in blood, and I was writing 4-step system like that. So that's where it all began. And then as I wrote that book...
So that's 2002.
This is early 2000s.
Okay, early 2000s,
And I remember thinking, well, okay, if Jiu-Jitsu is a 4-step system, what would happen if you took little components within that 4-step system and created subsystems? What would happen then? So if you got to, say, for example, guard position, and you had a system of ways to attack from closed guard, and then ways to attack from butterfly guard, and you created these little subsystems within an overarching system, would that improve performance? So I started playing around with that. Things got more interesting when a very talented American grappler called Dean Lister came to Renzo Gracie Academy. He was invited by Matt Serra to do some training, and he came
years
in
later, mid 2000s.
This
later.
This would be earlier. This would be, I think, early 2000s. This is all happening around the same time.
Okay.
And
Dean had fought in Pride.
Yes, he fought various mixed martial arts. I don't know if he fought in Pride, but I could be wrong about that, but he certainly had quite a bit of mixed martial arts experience. But this was pretty early in Dean's career. Okay. And he came in and he was doing leg locks, mostly in those days Achilles locks. He became famous for heel hooks later in his career, but at this point it was all Achilles locks. And I remember watching him train with some of the guys, the upper belts at the academy, and this was really interesting because our school didn't really focus on leg locks at that time. We did them, but it wasn't like a set thing. And there was a pretty general bias against leg locks in the sport. They were seen as kind of cheap, like it was like a cheap shot. And I remember looking at Dean's team saying, well, he's pretty effective with that. It's working. This is not just some ineffective technique. And that was also one of the great criticisms of leg locks. They don't work. Like you can tap out a white belt with that stuff, but anything above that, it's just going to get you in trouble. And I remember talking to him afterwards, and he said, why would you ignore 50% of the human body? And I remember thinking like, yeah, why would you? And
did you ever think, why didn't I think of that?
Of course, yeah. Like you say, the whole idea is to submit people. That's the whole point of Jiu-Jitsu, control to submission. Like, why would you arbitrarily say that 50% of the body is off limits? Now, there are reasons in Jiu-Jitsu for that. It's not foolishness on the part of the old masters. They reasoned that the more high percentage submissions are upper body submissions. And there was some truth to that. If you looked at the stats in those days, lower body submissions didn't figure particularly highly, and you could easily argue, well, they're right. there's a reason why we don't attack the lower body, because you could lose position. I thought about that for a while. I was like, lose position. Well, if I do an armbar from mount and it doesn't work, and that's pretty likely, I lose position just as easily there, but no one's criticizing armbars from mount.
Yeah.
And then I thought, they're too dangerous to do. I was like, well, the most dangerous things I've seen in jiu-jitsu were things like flying guard pulls. I've seen more people wrecked by those than I ever saw by any leg locks, and they're legal. So it can't have to do with the potential danger that these locks have. I mean, there's nothing intrinsic about leg locks which makes them somehow more dangerous to the limbs than arm locks are. I've seen more people get limbs dislocated by kimura holds than I have by heel hooks. And so most of the early criticisms of leg locks didn't really hold weight. If you just question them, you realize that they really weren't that good.
A weird cultural bias.
Yeah, there was a cultural bias. Jiu-jitsu is a sport derived from judo. And judo, of course, put a ban on leg locks many years ago. And as a result, jiu-jitsu stemming from judo took on a little bit of that bias against leg locks.
Why did judo put the ban on it?
I believe, I can't state with certainty, but I do believe 1925 they were banned for safety reasons.
Okay.
There was a significant rule change in 1925 where numerous techniques were outlawed. Other things like slamming from guard were also outlawed. And I may be wrong about the date, but I'm pretty sure 1925 was like a seminal year in rule changes for judo, and various forms of leg lock were banned. So jiu-jitsu did take that on a little bit. So some of it was cultural, some of it was practical. There was a belief that leg locks really were less effective. But what I did see in leg locks is tremendous potential. What I saw is that probably the single greatest thing you can find in life is an undervalued product. Okay, there's always an objective value of a product and its perceived value. And very often those are two very different things. There's a lot of diamonds in the roughs out there that people misidentify as rough.
Because we're influenced by what other people say.
Absolutely,
and think. Especially when it comes to something like jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
It's passed on through word
generations. That your teacher, you can't argue with your teacher.
Right.
Your teacher.
Yeah, it's a picture of a guy in Brazil, and it comes from the Gracies, and you can't question that.
There's a lot of appeal to authority in martial arts, and authority counts for a lot. If so and so says this, then you better damn well listen. And I remember thinking, there's nothing mechanically different about locking legs than there is from locking arms. So
just more degrees of freedom, more complex.
Yeah. So I thought to myself, well, let's do some experimentation. So my main way of researching is always physically experimenting on the mats, particularly before my hip replacement. And I spent many years just playing around, tinkering with various kinds of leg lock. And what I always found was that the great deficiency of leg locks was the notion of control, that there was no positional control in leg locking. And as a result, leg locks were seen as a kind of a Hail Mary move, where you just kind of jumped into it and see what happens. And that was unacceptable. You can't just base your game on Hail Mary moves. There has to be this idea of control. And jiu-jitsu I've always understood jiu-jitsu was control leading to submission. What I saw lacking in the leg lock game was the notion of control. It did have a lot of potential as a submission hold, but it lacked the prerequisite control to make it effective in combat.